Greetings. So, I'm sure this video is going to piss off a lot of people. I'm okay with that. And I've actually made this video several times already in the past. But usually whenever I've made it, I've been in kind of a concerned mood. And I think that's had a detrimental effect on the video as a whole. So I'm re-recording it now in a slightly more amused mood, because I think that perhaps fits the tone a little bit better, or will lend better to how the video comes across. Now, I've got a lot written out, and a lot of this video will be me simply reading what I've got written out, so bear with me. Can Goth be defined? Certainly Goth can be defined in many ways. One can discuss the ancient culture of the Goths, divided into what we call the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. One can describe the characteristics specific to Gothic architecture from an historical or aesthetic standpoint. One may describe Gothic literature and what differentiates it from other types of writing. One may discuss the Goth music genre, which split off from punk in the late 70s and early 80s. But none of these things directly concern the definition of the Goth culture as it exists today. The current culture can be defined as well, and has been by many, whereas the validity of those definitions will be called into question later in this discourse. Goth is a thing, and because it's a thing, it may be defined. Objective statements may be made about the culture and about the subjective experience of that culture. And from these statements, a definition can be formed. But one of the most important aspects to this is that unlike every other Goth definition or what is Goth video I've ever seen, it's always a subjective viewpoint. It is true that a tremendous number of Goths have made videos and blog posts describing how they define Goth, explaining to the largely uncaring world what Goth means to them. Overall, these pronouncements mean very little. If everyone defines Goth in their own way, in entirely subjective terms, it becomes pointless and indeed impossible in any useful way to discuss Goth as a topic. If these definitions are to be seriously considered, then no statement can ever be made about Goth without the entire context of its personal definition also being given. And this makes discussion tedious to the degree that it's no longer worth discussing. If you have to explain what your definition of Goth is every time you're going to talk to somebody about it, because everyone has their own definition, that's just ridiculous. When it comes down to it, it's really just ridiculous. Should Goth be defined? Much to the chagrin of many punks and extreme individualists, labels are a requirement of language. Without using labels, we would be incapable of transmitting the most simple of ideas. Labels are essential tools for communication, and often are packed full of cultural meaning. In the case of the Goth culture, using the label to describe oneself allows those in the Goth society to define themselves in a way that avoids having to list every notable aspect of their personality that they're aware of and subscribe to. It is true that I thoroughly enjoy most activities in which Goths are known to participate. Such a list of activities, however, is extensive, and it's far more useful for me to simply tell people I am a Goth than to try and remember and regurgitate all of those different aspects anytime someone asks what I'm like. It is true that I enjoy a macabre and mysterious atmosphere, that I do what I can to create that atmosphere in my dress, my home decor, through the music that I listen to, and the books that I enjoy. If I describe myself as a goth, this is implied, these things. People can come to the conclusion that I probably do enjoy them. And I don't have to expound upon it, either in a discussion with others, or even just as I ruminate on my own ideas of what kind of person I am. This may be the most useful aspect of goth culture, in fact, in that it provides goths with a home base from which they are generally more free and allowed to study other aspects of themselves. If I'm able to internally associate myself with the goth culture, I'm then free to approach other questions I may have about myself without a worry about a full-blown identity crisis. I can explore things like gender association or sexuality, knowing that if I discover something I hadn't anticipated, my complete identity isn't put into question because I still know that I'm a goth. And I can always return to that, to a place of safety. I can proclaim internally that I know at least that much about myself, and from that point I can calmly test other notions of who I may be. In this way, the goth culture is an extremely positive force and acts as a sanctuary for all those who choose to dwell within it. This aspect is, however, entirely dependent upon the goth culture as a whole having a comprehensive definition. If it doesn't have one, the internal sanctuary of the culture has no foundation and no longer provides these benefits. For that reason alone, I suggest that not only should goth be more clearly defined, but that it must be. The current ambiguity of the definition of goth also magnifies the problems inherent when used by those, principally the media, outside the culture. Goths know full well that we tend to abhor resorting to violence in almost all cases. Meanwhile, the media has violence practically wedded to what they consider goth to be. This can never be resolved until the goth culture has a rugged and specific definition to give to those outside the culture of what it is that we are. So long as the world outside goth society sees videos and blogs from every goth and his pet tarantula stating what goth means to them, they'll attribute whatever characteristics they want to our culture, because we're the easiest scapegoat on the block. Furthermore, we have no real rebuttal that holds any weight. We can scream to the heavens all we want that goths aren't violent. But until we have a solid definition that includes that as an inherent ideal, or perhaps more appropriately simply a definition that ignores violence in all ways, a denial by omission, our complaints fade into nothing. Goth culture desperately needs and deserves a cohesive definition that any goth can give to anyone, raising a blaming finger to point at our society. I believe the history of these events proves the importance of being able to do so far outstrips the importance of any individual goth feeling limited by goth culture being defined. I personally believe those who declare that goth is limiting are simply too far limited in their understanding of what goth is. Though that's perhaps a discussion best held at a different time. Often, goths mistake an attempt to maintain a purity of definition for purposes of communication of ideas as an attempt to maintain purity of membership or of being a part of the culture, and brand those seeking the former as elitists to suggest some kind of bigotry is at work. Elitist is the most recent incarnation of the scarlet letter within the goth culture. Anytime a goth with weak or no arguments against another's strong opinion wants to bring an argument to a close, it seems they resort to marking them as an elitist. An elitist is one who believes that an elite exists within a society, superior to all others, and who lead by divine or some similar right. Giving your opinion that somebody isn't goth in no way, shape, or form suggests that an elite exists or that one holds sway in the culture. It is simply a stated observation. I've created a video previously that covers this discussion of elitism, and I'll provide the link for it below, because I don't really need to go into it all again now, but it was important to kind of point this aspect out, I think, in this video. Defining Goth. The aspects of Goth that I find most pervasive among those who claim to be part of the culture are as follows. Number 1. A social departure from the mainstream. Our culture is really only useful if it involves a departure from the mainstream. It's that departure that reaffirms our strength of self and unifies us. It's not a rule, but it is a tendency and a characteristic that we share with one another. Number 2. An aspect of morbidity and appreciation for an expression of the macabre. Living a lifestyle imbued with a sense of morbidity and a delight in dead things, however romanticized that may or may not be, could safely be pointed at as the center pillar of what differentiates us not only from the mainstream, but from subcultures. We are not the only ones to appreciate these things, but all the other aspects our culture displays without the death element don't culminate in anything goth. If you remove that appreciation for death, everything else, the wearing of black, everything else you'll see that I've found as a defining characteristic, you can put those things together and it still doesn't make anything goth without that aspect of morbidity. Dark, perhaps, but not goth. Embracing darkness, manifest as the color black, or, sometimes more creatively, as dark moods and dark humor. Not everything that's black is goth, certainly. And one may certainly be morbidly sarcastic or depressed without being goth, but these concepts are part and parcel of the culture. Many retort that there are those who have achieved the pinnacle of the Gothic spirit in all white, but I suggest that they succeed in doing so because they take on the aspect of phantoms and spirits of the dead, things stemming from our darkest fears and desires. And these are exceptions, there's no denying that. The majority of Goths enjoy wearing lots of black clothes and portraying dark imagery and dark psychological themes. A sense of mystery, madness, and the arcane. Even more than departing from the mainstream, almost all Goth things depart from the material plane in some way. From Gothic literature, Gothic music, and fashion, to our penchant for choosing Gothic names for ourselves, home decor, and maintaining a demeanor of being aloof from the norm, we present ourselves as a mystery. To defy hard categorization, we reveal shades of madness, and in many cases, an interest in the actions of the insane bordering on obsession. Many of us employ occult imagery to inspire that sense of otherworldliness that also sharpens the definition of what Goth is. The act that links all of these aspects, the salt circle of the ritual that binds us together, the corset which we carefully lace to hold it all in, is making these things an active part of our everyday lives. No, we don't don the mask of death every day, and we don't deny ourselves activities that have nothing to do with anything Goth. But engaging oneself in all of these facets of Goth makes one an active participant. It means one not only knows a harmony with Goth, but sings it, consumes and projects it in equal measure. It is the act of being Goth. I have had a suggestion from some that a sixth aspect exists as well, that being a near universal renouncement of violence. While I'll admit a penchant for peaceful discourse in all matters, as I mentioned before, sometimes I feel that this one smacks of propaganda. Not so much that it is propaganda, but that it sounds like it from outside the community. if we give that as part of our definition, it is likely to sound to those who are not Goth like we're trying too hard to convince them that violence isn't part of our culture. When the only individuals whose opinion is valid on whether or not something is Goth are Goths, an interesting question arises. When someone who makes no claim to being Goth, or who outright denies that they are Goth, is declared Goth by the majority of the culture who are concerned with it, are they Goth? To clarify that a little, I'll give the example of Robert Smith, lead singer of The Cure. He has stated that he is not Goth more than once. If the Goth culture, as a generalized whole, consider him Goth, then is he? Or is his opinion the be-all and end-all in the matter? It seems to me most useful for him to be Goth, even if it is against his own wishes. First, because the idea of The Cure as a Goth band is so ingrained already in the ideals of the culture that reversing it at this point would be practically impossible. But more importantly, favoring the culture as a whole over an individual or a particular object or concept or activity gives the Goth culture the ability to adapt to change, to incorporate into itself new perspectives, and even to remove useless dross. It is this very tool that determines whether Goth will stagnate and wither, or flourish and bloom in new varieties of nocturnal beauty. It is also essential that the Goth culture define itself in order to protect against outside influences. More and more, the mainstream is appropriating parts of our culture, cheapening it, and changing the very meaning of it. Sadly, Rihanna is currently completely justified in creating her ghetto goth look because we have no definition to present as a contrast to her fashion drive. And when she presents herself as a goth to the mainstream, they accept it as part of the definition. We're powerless to maintain our identity because we've gone way too far in allowing everything to be goth. So there we have 5 aspects. Things that I have seen almost all Goths have in common. It's not my opinion of what Goth should be, but instead is a collection of ideals that we seem to share. Young and old. Both those who have just gotten into the culture and those who have been in the culture for a very long time. Whether you want to consider it 5 or 6 with the inclusion of the abhorrence for violence doesn't really make too much of a difference to me. But the thing is, I would really like, more than anything, for people to discuss this, to think about it on their own, to post comments in the comments section down below, to talk about it on Facebook, to scream your opinion on Tumblr. Why not? Because it seems a real weakness to me that we're incapable of telling the media, you have a skewed opinion of what Goth is. Here is what we are. And that they can go to, generally, any Goth and ask those things, and that Goth will say yes. That is the definition of Goth. I really think it's important for us to establish a common ground. And finally, to have a definition.